Hello and welcome to the eOrganic webinar on Selecting Modern Heirloom Beans by Thomas Michaels of the University of Minnesota. This is your host, Alice Formiga from the eOrganic Community of Practice. You can find all eOrganic published articles, videos, and recorded webinars on organic farming and research topics on our public website at the link on your screen. Today's presentation will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for your questions. Today, I'm very happy to welcome back Tom Michaels of the University of Minnesota. He's a professor in the Department of Horticultural Science there at the St. Paul campus, and he's also the coordinator of the undergraduate major in food systems. Tom and some of his colleagues presented another webinar about their dry bean production research several years ago, which is available in our archive, and I'm looking forward now to hearing more about what they have learned from their different dry bean projects. So with that, I'm going to hand over the microphone to you, Tom.
Thanks, Alice. Hi, this is Tom with today's webinar on selecting modern heirloom dry beans. This webinar in part reports on work that we've conducted at the University of Minnesota with support from USDA NIFA OREI grant program and also from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture grant program, where we've been targeting research for organic production systems. I really appreciate all of you joining today, and I look forward to your questions. Alice, may we have the second slide, please? In today's webinar, I'll address these four things: our motivation for working with heirlooms and the problems associated with that. I'll also explain the methods we used when selecting heirlooms and when comparing the selected materials to the original heirloom populations, review some of the key outcomes of our study, and finally share some recommendations for those of you who are interested in adapting heirlooms to your own locations. And I know that some of you, as we go along this 45 minutes, may need to check in or check out. And so I put a spoiler at the bottom. For those of you, the bottom line, it is the bottom line of this picture, is it works. So now you know the whole webinar, but I'll carry on anyway. When Alice and I conceived this webinar, we wanted to address an audience that included freelance breeders, hobbyists, students, master gardeners, people ranging from experienced breeders to gardeners interested in perhaps moving beyond seed saving. And I bring this up because I want you to feel included, and I want to share with you the detail of what we found, but have it be relevant to your situation. So if something that I say or show isn't making sense to you, please jot it down and ask me about it. Feel real comfortable about asking me about it during the question period, because I want you to come away from the webinar feeling like you can do this, or you have more information, more knowledge that you need to jump into it. Okay, may I have the third one, please, Alice? So why heirlooms? Part of my work here at the U of M is to develop new commercial type cultivars like pintos and navies and black beans that are grown in this area for organic production in more extensive scales, so 50 acres, 100 acres, larger operations. But when I'm sitting in my office like I am right now looking out the window, or teaching in my classroom in St. Paul, I'm really aware that I'm surrounded by a large metropolitan region with 1 million eaters. So I also feel the urge to breed for urban consumers who value culinary diversity and who seek out locally produced, often organic produce. Also, the Twin Cities has a strong group of small-scale vegetable producers who do direct-to-consumer marketing through CSAs, through food hubs, through farmers markets, and who, according to our market surveys, are really keen to take advantage of the price differential that's available from offering a novel, local, organic product like heirloom beans. And as you might expect, there are restaurants and other institutions in the metro that are looking for novel ingredients, again from local and organic sources, to create and offer unique signature menu items. So my point is that in this metro region, we have a healthy market and healthy market chain that goes all the way from the breeder to the consumer for local produce, including heirloom beans. So that's one of my motivations. And my note at the bottom about athletic affiliation is a reminder to me to just mention the potential for breeding food with colors that represent local athletic teams, like the maroon and gold of the University of Minnesota sports teams, or the purple of the Vikings. Initially, I know it sounds trivial, but in fact, it's not. It's a marketing hook that can matter at least to some consumers. So part of the motivation is that heirlooms have a place in the local food system here, and we can develop that marketing chain. All right, so the second motivation has to do with the constraints. And here I want to tell you a really short story. It's about my first experience with heirlooms when I was starting out as an assistant professor then at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada in the early 80s. My research focused on bean genetics and breeding for navy beans for commercial production. It's a short season environment, being in Canada. And I thought that perhaps if I sorted through some heirloom beans that Ontarians have grown and saved for years, maybe I'd find some new genes that really improve the productivity, the earliness of our commercial beans. So I sent out word through the extension network and asked for samples of heirloom beans. And I got a number of samples. And when I grew out the seeds, here was my surprise. I was really surprised to learn that contrary to my expectation, these beans in general were late maturing. They often had an inconvenient, to me, climbing plant habit rather than being nice upright bushes that I'd want for commercial types. And they're kind of unproductive. These were beans that the growers had babied, they had coddled, they had put in the nice part of their garden. They wanted to make sure they got seed every year. It's on the sunny south side, and they didn't necessarily have the adaptation to Ontario that I expected. So I learned some things from that experience. First of all, and one that's going to come up later in this, heirlooms aren't necessarily highly adapted to the region where they're grown, even if they've been saved and replanted for years, because the conditions aren't necessarily representative, say, commercial conditions, if that's your target. And secondly, their value isn't necessarily in those characteristics that contribute to commercial quality, but rather their value is in very personal features, like their connection to that family that sent me the beans, or to their use in a particular dish, or to their history, or to their novelty. And I tell you that story because the second part of the motivation that I wanted to mention is to improve the adaptation to a particular region. When you work with heirlooms, there's work to be done. Once we move heirlooms into a marketing chain, those personal features like their connection to the family, which are so important on an individual level, really have to also be supported by good productivity, like appropriate maturity, ease of production, and good yield, for them really to be adopted by other growers and to start being used in the local food chain. So that's what I mean by adaptation. So my early experience with heirlooms made me cautious about their adaptation. And when I started this project, I knew we had some constraints. So now to the slide. The performance things we're trying to look for are adaptation to North Central Plains, in my case. And these have to do with the architecture that makes it convenient to grow more of an upright bush, early maturity, good yield, and also have all of that done in organic production systems. Now, another feature of heirlooms is they probably, because of the way they've been saved, the seed's been saved over the years, probably have more plant-to-plant genetic differences within the population than you find with commercial, say, pinto beans, which are very genetically uniform. So within soldier beans, you'll find genetic differences among plants, and you're not going to find that within pintos, or it's going to be slight. So we were interested in whether there's enough genetic variance within heirlooms to allow us to do selection within an heirloom population and improve its adaptation to Minnesota. Okay, so our first study was simply to look at the performance of a number of heirlooms across environments, across different organic production systems, and include also some commercial beans in there as checks. So we used, as I'm showing here, 4 organic production environments. We had 17 heirloom beans, which I'll show you in a moment. We included 3 commercial checks, a pinto, a navy, and a black bean. And what I'm going to show you are the data that we collected for overall yield, and I'm also going to show you data for how that yield varied for a cultivar across those 4 locations. Now, we also took data on maturity and other characteristics, but I'm going to focus here on yield and yield variance. So next slide. Here are the beans, 20 of them, and you will see some old favorites here. Bottom left-hand corner is Jacob's Cattle. One row up, 4 over is Soldier Bean. Up on the top, we have a couple versions of black and white beans, Yin Yang and Calypso. So there are a number of common ones there, and then some maybe less common. But I'm always astounded by the beauty and variability that I see among these heirloom populations. And then on the bottom right, I have the checks. The very bottom right corner is a navy bean, OAC Rex. Then Lariat Pinto, which is extensively grown in these parts, and Eclipse black beans. So these are the 17 heirlooms and the 3 checks. Now, we looked at more heirlooms than this initially, but I winnowed it down to these 17 for reasons of especially their architecture. A lot of heirlooms that I looked at were maybe misclassified in the catalogs and were runners, or when I grew them, yeah, they were bush, but they're really sprawled out on the ground and just wouldn't work, or they're very late maturity. So we did some screening initially, but these are the 17 that we went forward with. Okay, next slide. So I'm going to show you a figure here that initially maybe looks a little complex, but it's not. Let me talk you through it. This is just to give you an example of what you'll see in the next slide. So what I'm trying to graph on this figure is yield overall and also the variation in yield across those different environments. So on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, which is our vertical axis, I'm plotting the mean yield. That would be the yield of a variety across all locations. And then on the x-axis, which is on the bottom, the horizontal axis, that would be, it says coefficient of variation. You can think of it as the variation across those 4 environments. So how did, for instance, Calypso do across all 4? Was it the same across all 4, meaning it has a low variance, or was it high in one, low in another, mediocre in the third, and so it has a lot of variation? So I've divided these into 4 quadrants. So in the upper left, and I have in green letters, these are the heirloom cultivars or checks that had high yield overall and had low variance. That means they not only had high yield, but they had that really good yield across all environments. That's in the top left quadrant. And then in the top right quadrant, we have high yield, but also high CV, high variance. That means that it was high, but it really fluctuated a lot depending upon your location, so it wasn't inconsistent. So I have that in yellow, caution. And then in the bottom left, again in yellow for caution, these are the ones that are low yield but stable. In a way, I kind of laugh. These are the beans that we can count on performing poorly. Is that a good thing? I don't know, but at least they're consistent. And then in the bottom right, in red, these are the ones that are a real headache because they not only have low yield, but they also vary quite a bit, so we can't be quite sure how bad they're going to be in a given year. So really, when we look at this, what we want are those varieties that tend to be high yield with low variance. Okay, next slide. So what do we have? Here's how our 20 plotted out. The green circles are around the 3 check varieties, Lariat, OAC Rex, and Eclipse. And you can see right away, because they're high on this graph, they're in the upper part, they had higher yield than all of the others on average across all environments. And really that's to be expected. They were bred for this region. They were intensely selected to have very high performance. So the fact that their seed yield is better than heirlooms that were developed who knows where, various places, and brought here doesn't surprise me all that much. So there they are, high yield. 2 of them, also Rex and Lariat, have pretty good a low coefficient of variation, meaning not only are they high yield, but they're consistently high yield. They're in that category that is really valuable. Eclipse is showing a little bit more variability. Now I have orange circles then around those heirlooms that are in or very near that upper right quadrant. One's called Perigian. Perigian, if you think back to that slide, it was one that had a mixture of different seed colors. There are blacks and there are various types of beige stripes and black stripes with a buff background. That's Perigian, not only pretty good yield, but also very stable. The one right at the 1500 mark, JCG, that's Jacob's Cattle Gold. It looks like Jacob's Cattle, but Jacob's Cattle is maroon with dots, and Jacob's Cattle Gold substitutes gold for that maroon. It also has average yield, but really good stability. LS is Lena Cisco's Bird's Egg, and then the TE/SYE, that actually refers to Tiger Eye, which is another one that has pretty good response given that. Now the reason I'm pointing these out is those are the beans, the heirloom populations that later on we focused on, and this is why, because they had a good combination of stability and yield, and others fell below that. Okay, next slide. So just what are my general impressions about this so far? Well, first of all, the commercial cultivars, I've pretty much gone through that already. They do well performance-wise. They were bred for local adaptation and uniformity, and they're showing it. I was interested to see there was still some fluctuation in stability. They weren't head and shoulders above the heirlooms the way they were at yield for that stability characteristic. The heirlooms are a different story in terms of performance. And I look at it this way. The priority with heirlooms in saving seed is to maintain seed characteristics. So when I think of Jacob's Cattle Gold, it has the key characteristic there is the way the seed looks. And so when I'm saving seed, I'm going to keep those seeds that look like that. A secondary consideration might be how it looks in the garden. I might or might not do selection based on that, but I certainly am going to maintain the right seed characteristics. So as a result of putting the priority on seed and maybe secondarily on how it's performing in the garden, they're going to show more diverse architecture, maybe differences in maturity and yield and stability. But the fact that there's that variability there within those heirlooms means there might be an opportunity then to select within these heirlooms for better adaptation. So next slide. So the question we now raised is, can we adapt heirlooms to our conditions here? And so what does that mean by adaptation? Just to reiterate that, it means trying to improve the performance in a specific region. And again, I'm going to mention that I get it that heirlooms are about more than performance. It's about the story, it's about the connection, it's about the cuisine, it's about the flavors and taste. But when we're putting these into a market chain, even if it's a local organic market chain, performance and stability are going to be important. So that's why I come back to that. Can we improve the performance in the upper Midwest here? And that means knowing that not only is it getting good yield, is it going to be stable across years, is it going to mature on time, do we have reasonable uniformity there, and are we maintaining those consumer attributes that made it desirable in the first place, maintaining those seed coat colors and marketings in particular. And it may well be, although we didn't test this, that there are particular cooking qualities like quickness to cook or texture of the bean or subtle flavors that also may need to be maintained. And part of the adaptation process that I mentioned last year is that we also have to develop a market chain from seed producer to eater. And let me just take a really quick sidetrack on this because I'm not going to talk about it anymore, but one of the interesting things about breeding for a local organic market compared to a commercial market is that in a commercial market, if I come up with a new navy bean, there's an infrastructure for me to hand that bean off that includes seed producers and distributors and farmers and a processing network, all know what to do with that bean. And so as a breeder, I just have to develop it and kind of hand it off. But for these local and organic types or heirlooms, if I develop and improve, let's say Jacob's Cattle Gold, that infrastructure is not in place. And so we also have to, in part of that, adapting the heirlooms, make sure that we have people who can grow the seed, we have growers who can produce the crop, we have a market for that crop at co-ops, through CSAs, through restaurants, and we have eaters, we have consumers who know about it and who want that. So the problem isn't just let's breed something that's really cool. We need to also have that market chain. Okay, thanks. Next slide. So back to the problem at hand. Is there enough within heirloom genetic diversity that we can make gain from selection within an heirloom? So to answer that question, we did this. The first year, for each of those 17 heirlooms, we planted out 300 or so, between 200 and 300 seeds of each. Our target was 300 in a plot, and we kept them fairly well spaced planted, like maybe 3 seeds per foot or something like that with 30-inch rows. So we had enough room to see each plant pretty well and grew them. And at harvest time, what we did was we chose at random, and this isn't necessarily what you do, but what we did to try to maintain all the genetic diversity there, we identified at random 60 plants per heirloom. And we'd harvest a plant and we'd keep the seed separate from each plant. This is important. So we have 60, from each heirloom now, we have 60 separate bags of seed that all trace back to 60 individual plants. All right, and we did that for all 17 of these heirlooms. In the following year, we went back to those 60 bags of seed from each heirloom and planted a row from each of those bags. So we went from plant in one year to row the next year. So in the subsequent year, for each heirloom, we now have 60 different rows. And one of the reasons, and I'll reiterate this a couple times in the talk, it's way easier to do selection when you're looking at a row than when you're looking at a plant. When you're looking at a plant, there are so many things that go into whether that plant looks good to you and is superior or inferior, and a lot of it's environmental. Only some of it's genetic, if any. But when you plant a row, now you've got lots of plants over a number of different environments, even though it's microenvironments, and you can see the potential of that genotype better as a row, way better. It's way easier than as a plant. So the following year, we looked at these single rows. Next slide. So what did we find? Well, we did some statistic calculations of how much genetic variance was, and I was a little surprised. For Jacob's Cattle Gold, we didn't detect any genetic variance. That's Jacob's Cattle Gold on the top, so they're kind of in order here. Phrygian, the one with mixture of different seed types, we had genetic variance for days to flowering, number of nodes, seed yield, seed weight, size of the seed. For Lena Cisco's bird's egg, which is that cranberry type one, the third one down, only for seed weight. And then for Tiger Eye, which is maroon and gold stripe, ooh, this is going to get back to that idea of sports teams, isn't it? The Tiger Eye was only for number of nodes. So I came away from this a little discouraged because I thought we'd have an enormous amount of genetic variance. It was easy to measure, and in fact, the opposite was true. We had some, but not a lot. And also you'll notice that it was variance for different things within each heirloom. But we threw caution to the wind and did selection anyway because this was just a statistical estimate and who knows how much error was there. So we went ahead and selected anyway. So may I have the next slide? What we did then was out of those 60 rows for each heirloom, we identified the 6 best. So we kept 10% of those rows. And I have best in quotations because best is kind of a breeder's menagerie of impressions of a plant. Part of it is due to the data that you get. What is the seed yield from that row? Some of it is how it looks in the field, which is your impression of how easy it might be to grow. Or whatever. But if you've done some selection or breeding, you know what I mean? It is a combination of things that goes into what makes it the best. But we did use a combination of data, maturity, where the pods were on the plant, number of pods, all those sort of things. And so we picked the 6 best. And we then conducted trials, organic trials, in 2014 and 2015, and we've got some in 2016 again. And we included 2 checks. For each heirloom, we included a sample of the original population, unselected, and we also included a sample of seed from each of the 60 rows. So 2 types of checks to represent the original population, plus the 6 selection and we collected data on maturity, on architecture, and various yield parameters. Okay, next slide. So what did we find? Were those 6 better than the 60 that they came from? Well, for some, we did make gain from selection. So Jacob's Cattle Gold, we were able to select plants with more pods and earlier maturity. Lena Cisco's, we made some gains in some things, and you can see them there. So some of these were for those characteristics where we were able to measure genetic variation, but in others we made gain from selection even though our initial statistical estimate didn't suggest that we could. So despite low estimates of genetic diversity, we still made some gain from selection. So here's the bottom line from this. From our initial work in selecting pure lines out of heirlooms, we were able to make measurable shifts. Shifts that are not just measurable, but you could see it with your eye that this line is different and better than the original population, but not huge dramatic differences. So one of the first recommendations I'm going to make going into this is if you start doing selection with heirlooms, particularly in bean heirlooms like we did, don't expect to hit a home run right away. You are going to be able to make gain that gives you better adaptation, but it's not going to be, at least based on our experience, enormous dramatic changes. Okay, next slide. Here's another way of looking at this idea of what is best. So there are various different ways that breeders put together indexes of various things that we measure about a variety. So trying to put together yield, a number of nodes, and percentage of pods up in the plant that's high, and seed weight and things like that. How do you put that into one number? And one way to do it is through this ZScore performance index. So what this is about is if we make a kind of combine all these traits together into one number, how did these selections look relative to the 60 that we selected them from after we looked at them for several years? So the Z-score is on the left side, and if you squint, you can see that in the middle is 0, and then it becomes positive as you go up and negative as you go down. And so positive means we're making gain, and negative means that we're not. There are lots of little gray dots, and those are the 60 that we started with, and you can see some black triangles which represent the 6 selections that we made. So just if you kind of blur your eyes and look at this, you'll see that the selections we made tended to be, with a couple of exceptions, above 0. So we were selecting among the better materials that were in the population. And the red arrows, I'm glad to say, we were able to select the lines that over time were found to be the very best of the 60. So that initial selection using rows did allow us to capture some of the best lines, including what appear to be the best lines based on these Z-scores. Okay, next slide. So what are we doing with this? We have conducted the evaluations again in 2015 and currently in 2016, and are particularly focusing on those 4 heirlooms and the 6 lines. Actually, we've whittled it down to 4 now, in larger trials and in multiple locations. And we're going to combine those data with the 2014 data that I've already showed you, and our goal is to pick a winner. I would like to be able to come up with a Lena Cisco that's better adapted, and a Tiger Eye, and so on, Phrygian, and a Jacob's Cattle Gold that we can release in the upper Midwest as being better adapted versions. And so that's our modern heirloom, if you will. But because we don't know which yet, we're waiting for all the data to come in. One of the problems with waiting until we have all the data is that we get behind in seed production. So another one of our activities is we've already initiated seed production of 16 different potential cultivar releases so that we get our seed quantity up. We did seed production in the greenhouse over winter so that we produce it in a disease-free environment, and we've got field production now. So that by the time we get to the 2017 growing season, we're ready to go out to organic producers with the opportunity to have them do some trials and give us feedback on which they think are the best ones. So we have seed production that we've done, and the last thing is that I'll mention is we're continuing to work on the market chain in order to try to identify small producers who will be interested in producing seed, and also on the opposite side of the market to try to create demand, particularly in restaurants. And I'll just mention something about seed that I've noticed. When I visit the coasts, either east or west coast, I'm always in awe with the number of people who are involved in seed production. And I say that because here in Minnesota, it's relatively few. There are lots of commercial seed producers, and there are some produces organic seed, but there aren't a lot, or at least there aren't a lot that I'm aware of around the Twin Cities. So one of my tasks, and one of the things I talk to my students about as opportunities in the Midwest anyway, is to try to develop a business that produces seed, because there, I think, my opinion, there are going to be more opportunities to produce a seed for local and organic markets, particularly of materials that are specialized for that region, like the new lines that I want to come out with here, and I really want them produced in this area, but I'm flummoxed a bit because we don't have those seed producers, and we need to develop that part of the market chain also. All right, next slide. So perhaps the important part for you, now that I've gone through some of my own experiences, what does this mean for you if you're a freelance breeder or you want to move up your game in terms of seed saving, or even if you're a experienced breeder and want to work with heirlooms? Well, what I can say is we improved 4 heirlooms without using really difficult techniques, pretty straightforward techniques, and you can too. Our program focused on adaptation, adapting heirlooms to our region rather than trying to create novelty. So I didn't talk about making new crosses or anything like that. It's just we've got a bean that's really cool seed types. Can we keep that but have it grow better in Minnesota? And again, as part of my advice, it's really a 2-step process. The first is to select a lot of plants the first year, identify a lot of plants the first year, but because you're choosing individual plants, and because it's really difficult to make good choices when you're just looking at one plant, make sure you take a bunch. So I took 60, started with 300 and kept 60. And then you grow rows of those the next year and make your choices, your really critical decisions, when you have a row of seed rather than a single plant. And then the last overall recommendation is, based on what we found anyway, don't expect earth-shaking dramatic improvements, but do expect that you can make some gain and meaningful gain from selection. Okay, next slide. So keys to selecting. If you haven't done this before, I want you to dive into it. And if you have, you can probably add to this based on your experience. But here's my #1 key. And I've already mentioned this once, but it bears repeating. It's way easier to identify a great row of beans than a great bean plant. And that goes back to that idea, when you're doing your initial identification, take a lot of beans, because it's really hard to say, looking at one plant in the field, this one's way better than the other one. It might be growing on a really wonderful fertile patch of soil, and the one you're comparing it to could be growing on a rock. So it could be just environmental, and that's not going to carry through for your selection. It's only the genetics that does. So that's where the row comes in handy. So #2 key, grow out lots of plants. But there's a limit. When I look at populations of plants, even when I'm making crosses, I tend to limit the size of my populations to not over 300 plants. Other breeders will argue with that and say large is better, but I've looked at some simulations in diploids like beans that suggest to me I could probably get away with 60 rather than 300, and I'm only going to 300 just to cover all my bases. So grow out lots of plants. Don't have ridiculous numbers. If you have 60, that's probably fine. And then you can select maybe 5 to 10% of those. And I like, in beans, I like to select at maturity. I know a lot more is going on during the season. If I go out now, for instance, I can see a lot of diseases that I can select for because the leaves are on the plant. But there's something about maturity and selection that really speaks to me. When I'm looking at the beans, they can tell their story to me at maturity way better than I can tell right now. So maybe I'll identify some beans with tags or something based on disease right now, but I want to see them when they're ready for harvest. I want to see what their maturity is, where the pods are held, what the conformation is. I want to crack a pod, look at the seeds. I can't do that in July. I can't do it in August. I can only do it in September. So I do my selection at maturity. Number 4, include some diversity. If you're doing selection, and if you've done this, you know what I mean, you'll see some plants that are outstanding. But they're outstanding in today's environment. What's it like tomorrow? What's it like on someone else's farm? So sure, go ahead and select some of those, but make sure you take some other types of plants that are in there too, so that when you're collecting your selections, your individual plant selections, you've got some diversity there and you don't have all your eggs in one basket. Number 5, I'm giving you all these rules, but don't stress. This is supposed to be fun. What's more fun than working with plants out in the field? So breeding's fun, and I have to, obviously I have to tell myself this too. There's not a right choice. The right thing to do is go out and choose. That's really the best thing you can do. Keep it fun. The 6th one is preserve the identity of the seed from each plant. Remember I said you identify a plant, you take all the seeds from that plant, put it in a separate bag, and then next year you grow a row from that bag. So there's some organizing you have to do, some database management, some organization of bags, but preserve that identity so that next year you can take the seed from that plant, grow it out in a row, and when you find those wonderful rows, you can then harvest all that seed within a row and use it as your new variety. So that's my number 7. Next season, plant a row of seed from each selected plant, but also remember to plant a row of the original seed for comparison. If you don't do comparison, you don't really know if you're making gain. You need to compare it to the original variety, and then you can say, yeah, I've made it earlier, I've made it taller, I've made it whatever, because you have the original to compare it to. You can't use your memory from last year because that was last year. Okay, next slide. Now, remember I was saying I've been focusing here on adapting heirlooms, maintaining their critical characteristic, which is their seed characteristics. But if you're getting involved in breeding, you may also be interested in novelty. And here my recommendation is one that I got years and years ago from one of my professors who said, cherish your exceptions. And you probably do this already. If you are looking at a bunch of seed that you're harvesting, let's say from a bean plot, and you're taking a look at the seeds, of course you're going to say, well, what's that? When you come across a bean that doesn't look like it should, if it's not a Jacob's Cattle Gold in a row of Jacob's Cattle. It could be a number of things. It could be a mechanical mixture. It could be an accident. You planted the wrong seed in the wrong place. But it could also be the result of a chance outcross, because there's outcrossing depending on where you are. You might have 5%, maybe upwards of 10% outcrossing if you have a lot of vectors and lots of pollinator plants around. Maybe you'll have higher percentage of so you can get off what might be considered off types, but those are your exceptions. Those are the ones you can cherish. So if you want novelty, go ahead and select your unusual plants from this crop year. And even if it's kind of a brown or beige looking seed, that could be your F1, your original cross. Plant those seeds out and you might be really surprised at the beautiful colors and patterns that you get when you take look at the F2 generation. So cherish your exceptions, but again, remember to compare rows and do selection when you see rows rather than just plants. And at the end of the day, save the ones that you like the best. May I have the next slide? So I put up this slide because I wanted to remind myself to mention that The young smiley woman on the right, Hannah Swaygarden, is the master's student, completed her master's degree last year, who's responsible for a great deal of the analysis and discussion that I provided today. She did some of the selection, a lot of the analysis, and so a great deal of what I talked about today I owe to her energy. And she left here, finished her master's here, and went to Cornell, and is at Cornell now doing a PhD. And just a really, really brief story. When she went to Cornell, she had an orientation class in the fall, and as part of that orientation class, she was out in the field and hearing from a woman who's working in the corn breeding program, who happens to be on the left of this picture, and that's Judy Kolkman. And Judy Kolkman is working in the corn genetics group there and was explaining what they were doing to these newbie PhD students. And these two got together and talked and found out that they both had me as an advisor. And Judy had been a student of mine at Guelph probably 20 years ago, and Hannah just the other year. And I point this out because I mentioned before that breeding is fun because you're working with plants, but I find breeding fun because I can work with such great individuals who help me learn so much through the years. So thank you very much for your attention, and we're at about 42 minutes, and I would love to take questions at this point.
Okay, thank you so much, Tom. That was an informative and also very encouraging presentation. For our audience, in case you missed the beginning, I'd like to encourage you all to type in questions for the speaker into the question box, which we will be reading out loud for the next 30 minutes if we have enough questions. And I'd also like to say again that we've been recording this talk, and it will be available in about 2 weeks maximum, probably sooner, on the eOrganic YouTube channel and the eExtension website, and that's linked on our screen here. Also, if you have general questions about organic farming that have nothing to do with heirloom bean selection, you can feel free to use the free eExtension Ask an Expert service, and we have the link for that on your screen. But moving back to heirloom beans, we are getting quite a few questions and comments here. So I'm going to go first to a grower who writes in from northern Nova Scotia, and she has been growing and developing heirloom dry beans there for a number of years at a small farm scale, about 1.5 acres. And she says other regions may experience other production considerations. For example, we need beans that will dry down well under cover after being pulled early when the autumn rains start. Jacob's cattle doesn't work for us, Littlefield Special does. It seems to me that this method narrows the gene base, where in my maritime climate, variability to adapt to our changeable season is critical. One last thing here before you comment, Tom. I grow up to 1,500 row feet and row card during the season and then select individual plants from the pile of dried plants over the winter. I've quickly improved the productivity of my turtle beans and the disease resistance of her Black Valentine over 3 to 4 years.
So can I comment on the stability in Nova Scotia question? So this goes back to the idea that we have greater genetic variance in heirlooms than, for instance, we have in commercial types. and the selection method that I used here definitely does narrow the germplasm base, absolutely. So the first thing I'll say is, yes, that's absolutely true, and it's done intentionally for this region to try to make sure we've got as good adaptation as we can. Now, the idea, let me just briefly address the idea of that if you have greater genetic diversity within a population, it is better buffered against year-to-year differences in weather, for instance, meaning that in a population, some plants might perform better when it's a little cooler and wet, and other plants in other years perform a little better when it's hotter and drier. And so if you have a mixture of those things, you have a more stable population. And I understand that concept. When I measure it, though, when I try to find those differences through the trials that we've done using our stability approaches, I don't see that. And that could be because we're perhaps not in as variable an environment. I expect that more extreme environments, or let's say marginal in terms of making sure we get a complete season, it might be expressed more there. But when we do it here in the upper Midwest, in the plains, I'm finding that the pure lines that we're developing are as stable and tend to be maybe a little more stable than the heirlooms. So I'm not saying it isn't the case, I'm just saying that we're not able to measure it under our conditions here. But definitely the approach that I've used has narrowed the genetic base.
Okay. Can you explain more about how you will work on the market chain specifically, besides encouraging new breeders?
Yeah. Oh boy. I know how to breed plants, and I don't know how to, or at least I think I know how to breed plants, but I don't think I know how to do market chain. But I'm learning because someone has to do it. And it's been really fun working with the consumer end of things, particularly restaurants. I found chefs to be very welcoming of new products. And so when we have taken our beans to various chefs and said, would you evaluate these for us, they absolutely do it, and they give us great feedback and want more. And the problem is we're unable to provide them with what they want and need at this point. But that's been really good. So how do we do it? We try to engage restaurants initially. On the seed side, as I mentioned before, and you can tell by the strain of my voice, I'm a little concerned. I don't know quite how I'm going to develop seed growers, except that I noticed when I was working with the, I think it was the Eastern Canadian Organic Seed Growers Organization, and talking there, I noticed that there are a number of CSA owners who, once their CSA got a little bit larger, started branching into seed production as well. And so I'm just wondering if, as our CSA market matures here in the Twin Cities area, if some of those groups looking for other ways of using their land and their expertise, maybe they'll start being interested in seed production as well. But the other thing we're doing is we have a group that's working with me that is much more expert on marketing and is helping put these things in place. They wouldn't trust a breeder to do that.
Okay, this next person has two questions here. The first one is, are you trialing and selecting specifically under organic condition?
The answer is yes, we are. We're doing everything from our initial evaluations to the selection to the subsequent gain from selection trials. All of that's under organic systems. So we have a student organic farm here on the St. Paul campus where we do a lot of the research, and then we have done our evaluations at various CSAs around the Twin Cities, and we also now have a site at a research station in Carrington, North Dakota, and we've also used some organic plots in Lamberton, Minnesota. So we're focused mainly peri-urban, so around the Twin Cities, but we also have some a little bit further afield, but yes, under organics.
Okay, and here's the second question. Let's see, why do you think you found enough variation in a breeding crop without introducing other genetics through crossing?
Well, this goes back to the idea of heirlooms and how heirlooms are propagated. Now, the thing is, we don't know how an heirloom necessarily was propagated, but if it has been propagated by saving seed, that means that the selection pressure on that variety has been probably moderate unless you're in a very extreme condition. What I'm getting at is a lot of plants are saved, not just one or two, to make the variety. So a lot of plants are saved, and so that helps retain genetic variation that might be there from the origin of the bean, or that might have come into the bean through chance outcrossing. So that's retained by the fact that we're saving seed rather than going through the sort of process that I just mentioned of identifying single plants and rows from that plant. So because of that background, then I had hoped anyway that there would be enough genetic variation that we could make selection, and we could, but because the selection wasn't dramatic, the gain wasn't dramatic, it was moderate or even subtle, then I would say there wasn't an enormous amount of genetic variation. Now, I mentioned earlier, you don't always know how an heirloom was propagated. It's quite possible that somewhere along the line an heirloom came down to one plant, or maybe one seed that was saved. And that's a tremendous genetic bottleneck. And even if we take that one seed and after 3 generations of production, we now have thousands of seeds, still the genetics, unless there's been new introduced outcrossing, is going to be the same as what's in that seed. And that means there's an enormous amount of uniformity. And we just don't know with heirlooms. So, so what you need to do is know your heirloom, grow it out, take a look at it, see if you sense that there are plant-to-plant differences, and if so, give it a try with selection.
Okay. This person is wondering whether you can recommend any books or other resources on heirloom bean breeding.
I will give you a recommendation for a book that isn't just about heirlooms, but is comprehensive, and it is by Carol Deppe, D-E-P-P-E, and the name of it is Breed Your Own Vegetable Varieties. And the publisher is Chelsea Green. I've got it in my lap. I don't have this memorized. I got it in my lap right now, put it on my shelf. And it's, the copyrights were 93 and updated in 2000. But the fact that it's 16 years after that doesn't matter. It's solid information and well worth your time. And so if you're going to get one book on breeding vegetable varieties, get Carol's.
Okay, let's see. Here's another question from the bean breeder in Nova Scotia. Couldn't mass population selection techniques also work? My own work is still at the anecdotal stage, but I think it has potential, and marketing should always include recipes for the different varieties since texture and flavor differ between varieties. That's a great point. It has become a significant off-season income stream for our farm.
Absolutely on the recipes. Thanks for reminding me of that. That makes such a difference, and I heard that especially from CSA holders who are used to doing those things with their shares anyway. But the idea of having something to do with that crop once you get it is quite important. So thanks for reminding me of that. So mass selection techniques. For those of you who aren't aware, mass selection would be for instance, going through a population and choosing those plants that you feel are true to type, they represent the variety, and you would possibly tend, the fraction that you would save depends on the breeder, and you could subtly change the variety by doing that. So let's say we're in Nova Scotia and we want to do some mass selection. Probably the thing that I would be doing, I'm just guessing about the environment, but I would be selecting those plants that hit maturity the soonest, still having a decent pod set and nice-looking seeds, and I would save those seed. And by doing that, if there's a genetic reason for that rather than environmental, if there's a genetic reason for doing that, I am shifting the variety, and it absolutely can work.
Okay, let's see. We have some other marketing suggestions here. One person who is a master gardener as well as a market gardener suggested using master gardeners as a resource in seed production. Do you want to comment on that? Or?
master gardeners are one of my favorite groups of people because they allow me to train the trainer. That's sort of concept of let's take the information and can we distribute it more widely. And so we do that. We've done it less with this project than with some salad greens projects that I'm also involved with. And I'm chuckling to myself because master gardeners are also a really great reality check for me, because I can have some ideas of what I think might work, and instead of me going straight to the public and saying something that's crazy, I can say it to master gardeners, and they don't mind saying to me, Tom, you might want to rethink that, and it's so helpful. So I haven't thought of using master gardeners as the seed production group, but I like that idea. Thanks.
Okay. Also, how about the nutritional value of each variety? Are you testing for this when breeding as well? That might also be a potential characteristic to market beans on.
Yes, we evaluated protein and oil and various sugars. I'm trying to remember what other fractions. The various oils, those aren't terribly important in dry beans. And so we were particularly interested in protein because we have heard claims about heirlooms and how they might be better in one way or the other. And we did find some heirlooms that were showing higher protein than commercial types, but by and large, all beans are kind of in this area of high teens, low 20s in percent protein. That's kind of where they sit, and that's kind of where everything kind of sits, except you get some outliers, and the outliers that we found were some heirlooms. So yes, we did look at that. Now, did we use that as a selection criterion? No, we didn't, and neither did we use cooking quality or flavor. And that's not because I don't think those are important. In fact, they are quite important. They're important both in commercial beans and also in the local and organic. But it's simply we initially focused on adapting them in terms of productivity. But there's really interesting stories to be told about where we are in the nutritional aspects of beans.
Okay. Can beans be grown in high tunnels?
Well, the immediate answer I'd have is yes. We grow them in greenhouses, for instance. So certainly in high tunnels. The reason I pause is that I'm not sure, in fact, I don't think that would be the best use of the high tunnel in terms of return per square foot. So high tunnels typically would be used for fresh vegetables or fruits, strawberries in this area, strawberries, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, things like that, that are going to be in season, command a high value, and so you're getting a good value. But and to grow a long season crop like dry beans that have less value per square foot, I'd go, it'd have to be a seed crop for me to think it would be valuable. Unless, of course, the other reason for high tunnels is season extension. So if you want to grow a bean that you have trouble getting mature in a regular growing season, put it in a high tunnel and you can extend the growing season. The last thing I'd say about growing in a high tunnel is something we see in the greenhouse where light is limited a bit. So if you have light going through the glass of a greenhouse or the poly of a high tunnel, you're going to get a reduction in the energy of the light that's actually hitting the plants. And I think, this is my postulate, I think that's the reason why I see beans that normally would have a nice upright bush plant habit, when I grow them in the greenhouse, they become viney. So it's the same bean. I'll grow that outdoors, nice straight upright bean, almost looks like a soybean. I grow it indoors and I have to trellis it. Why is that? It's light. It's got to be light intensity, or yeah, it's got to be light intensity. I was going to say maybe day length, but no, it's light intensity. So if you grow beans in a high tunnel, you might have to be prepared to do some trellising, even if in the field they'd be upright bushes.
Well, speaking of trellising, this person is trying to select Vermont cranberry beans that have long vines to grow on fences. Do you have any comments about that?
You'll notice that we didn't do anything with pole beans because, oh, what a headache. But I can, that's just me talking. To me, the production, to do production even on an acre where I'm having to do trellising would be a problem. But I realize, a lot of people do indeterminate tomatoes, and it's not an issue. It's a high enough value, so you do it. So that's a really long way of me saying I don't have experience with working on those. But I can absolutely see the idea of trying to adapt beans that work well in a trellising situation. So what would you do? One of the things that strikes me about indeterminate beans to trellis is you might have, like you have with indeterminate tomatoes, beans that mature at different times. Now when it's a tomato, I get it. If I grow a tomato in my garden, I want some ripe now and some ripe later. But with beans, I think, even if it's a trellising type, I want maturity to be within a relatively narrow window so I can harvest all those beans at the same time. If it's a green bean, that's different. But if it's a dry bean, I think I'm going to want to select for a good climbing bean that's got lots of pods, but they all tend to mature in the same range. I'm just speculating because clearly I haven't done any work with those before.
Okay. Do you have any information on the drought tolerance of the various beans that you tested?
I did not take measurements on that, so I would say no. I will mention that there certainly has been work done at other places, and here I'm thinking of, I know that Sri Singh at University of Idaho is working on this once upon a time, and maybe others as well, trying to improve drought tolerance in commercial beans. So I know it's a thing, and one of the ways that was being looked at was to try to do crosses with another species of bean called Phaseolus acutafolius, which is the tepary bean, which is native to the southwest U.S., northern Mexico, and adapted better to drought. It's a tough cross to make that many believe can only be done using tissue culture, although some feel that they've gotten some natural crossing. But nevertheless, it's tough to make that cross. But there has been introgression of tepary bean, and that may have provided some additional drought tolerance. And that's a really long-winded answer when actually my answer is no, we didn't do that, measure any of that here.
Okay, this is the last question, I believe. If you have any other questions, we still have a few more minutes, so don't be shy about typing them in. Do you ever grow beans for soil enhancement? I guess this person's in an urban area, so was wondering about that.
Part of our project that we reported on a couple of years ago that Alice mentioned, and so you may want to go back and take a look at that webinar. Part of our project was looking at rotations in organic systems that included beans. And we were interested in the impact of dry beans in the rotation. That is, as a legume, are they adding any nitrogen to the system for subsequent crops? And that gets at your soil improvement question. Or are they actually scavenging nitrogen that might have been provided by an earlier crop in the rotation, which in our case was alfalfa. This project is just winding up, but the general impression that I have is that beans are fairly neutral in terms of their removal or their contribution to the rotation. That is, they're neither removing nor adding, or maybe I should say they are removing but also adding in similar amounts back to the soil, so that the subsequent crop feels no benefit of the beans but also is not suffering from the beans having removed nitrogen. So it's kind of neutral. So if I were to choose a crop to improve soil conditions, and I was looking at either adding organic matter or increasing the nitrogen component of that soil rotation, I wouldn't look to dry beans. I would make sure I had in the crop something else, in the rotation something else. And I mentioned alfalfa, another legume, maybe cowpea, maybe a non-legume like tillage radish might be something you want. We're looking at a bit of that here too, or other cover crops that provide organic matter. So I see beans more as a cash crop in the rotation rather than a soil enhancer in the rotation. But it's not doing harm, it's just not adding a whole lot to the soil either.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to let everyone know, in case you haven't already seen it, that I typed into the chat box the link to Thomas Michael's previous webinar from 2013 on organic dry bean production systems and cultivar choices. So you're welcome to access that. It's also on the eOrganic YouTube channel, along with our many other webinars. And I also wanted to remind everyone who's interested in seed production that we are in the middle of a 6-webinar series. Actually, we just started it. We just had the first one last month, but we're going to have another one on the 18th on organic seed production. So you are welcome to register for those webinars. It's free, and there are 6 total, one on the 3rd Tuesday of each month, going all the way through November. So if you're interested in seed production and need an introduction to that, please feel free to register and attend those webinars. So we're out of time now, but I'd like to thank everyone for your questions. So thank you so much, Tom, for your great presentation and for sharing your research, and thanks to everyone for joining us.